Welcome everyone. So for those who've just joined us since the CHIA Vic AGM, I'm Jason Perdrio, Acting CEO of CHIA Vic, and it's my pleasure to open this event, co-hosted with CHP, our political panel on the future of social housing and homelessness in Victoria. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and again pay my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of this land. The community housing sector visions a future in which all Victorians have the dignity of an appropriate, secure and affordable home. As we all head to the polls in just under 3 weeks, we've called on each of the political parties to make a solid commitment to investing in the future of social housing beyond the big housing build. In our election platform, we've asked our political leaders to partner with our sector on a range of policies and initiatives to continue to grow the supply of social housing and to better meet the needs of renters. We're very pleased to be able to hear directly from the spokespeople from the major parties today as they outline their visions for Victoria's housing and homelessness future and respond to a range of important questions that we're asking on behalf of our members and the members of CHP. To introduce the panel and facilitate the discussion today, I'm very pleased to welcome the CEO of the Council for Homeless Persons, Jenny Smith.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to CHIA for the opportunity to partnership in this important pre-election event. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on today and pay my respects to all elders and acknowledge that not any of these lands were ever ceded. So, as Jason said, we're 17 days out from the Victorian state election and very keen to know where our political leaders stand on social and affordable housing and on ending homelessness. And at CHP we are on tenterhooks about ongoing funding for H2H and homes and family programs. We're desperate to see an ongoing pipeline of social housing built in Victoria. We are acutely aware of the value of investing in preventing the failure of tenancies. We are wanting to see the work of the Royal Commission into Family Violence continue to completion with a housing guarantee for those fleeing family violence. We're arguing for a significant focus on the homelessness of young people in our community. We want to see the implementation of the Victorian Aboriginal housing and homelessness framework. We want to see continued investment in our workforce, and we are aware of the need for more improvement in our legal system's treatment of people without homes. So today the housing situation in Victoria is very challenging and it's getting worse. We've got extremely low vacancy rates, rising rents and acute shortages of rental housing that people on our lowest incomes can afford. The big housing build is halfway through its 4-year cycle to deliver an additional 12,000 social and affordable homes. But without continued investment, beyond this time we know that housing need and homelessness will continue to grow. Today we are just delighted to have with us our current Minister Danny Pearson, our current Shadow Minister Richard Reardon, and the Leader of the Greens in Victoria, Dr Samantha Ratton. So we've asked each leader to speak for 5 minutes, and we have a very tight time frame, and I will then ask the panel some questions on your behalf. So firstly to Minister Pearson. He's been a member for Essendon in Parliament since December 2014. He was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier from December 2018. And since June this year, he's been our Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Regulatory Reform, Minister for Government Services, and in our view, most importantly for us, the Minister for Housing. Danny has also been very caught up in the recent emergency responses, so it's particularly wonderful that he's come along today. So please join me in welcoming Minister Pearson to tell us about what he would do to create a clear and reliable pipeline for the growth of social housing beyond the big housing build.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present. Thank you so much for making yourselves available today. I am so fortunate to be before you because in this room there is a collective experience that goes back decades in relation to understanding some of the challenges that we have in relation to homelessness. And I think for me, I'm really pleased as a government that we haven't wasted a second in delivering social and affordable housing for Victorians since we had the great gift that is government when we were elected back in 2014. We've started that process of engaging in delivering on the big housing bill, which is the single biggest investment in social and affordable housing in the nation's history. Like, no one has attempted to do anything of this scale ever before, and it's something I'm so incredibly proud of, the fact that we are working towards delivering 12,000 new homes. And the fact that we are looking at also spreading this investment, not just in metropolitan Melbourne, though that's important, but we want to spread this right across the state, which is why we've got $1.25 billion going into regional Victoria and across 18 key local government areas in regional Victoria. As a government, we've also had the Social Housing Growth Fund, which is to invest $1.38 billion to deliver 4,200 new social homes through grants to registered community organisations. And I think for me this is something really important, and it comes back to my earlier comments about the value that you bring to the table, your knowledge, expertise, your experience. Something incredibly valuable that's in this room, and it's something if I'm so fortunate enough and lucky enough to be the minister after the election, I really want to tap into. Because we can't go back to the ways of the old. Right? You cast your mind back to the Housing Commission of Victoria. You know, what you had was unelectable, unaccountable, white, invariably male bureaucrats going around to communities and imposing solutions on the communities. You know, the great sort of slum reclamation efforts of the 1960s. And the view was that, well, we are the state, I'm the minister, I know what's right for you, and I will impose a solution on you without consultation, without discussion, because I know what's best. And I think through your lived experience and through the work that you've done in the sector, you've got your own insights. You've got your own lived experience and your own valuable contribution to make. And it's about having a conversation with the community housing sector to get this right. It's not 1962. It's not about providing housing for the nuclear family. We know the many different faces of homelessness and housing poverty that exist now in 2022 that did not exist back then. And so this sort of templated cookie cutter approach where we impose solutions because we think we know what's best is flawed. We need to be working more closely with Aboriginal controlled community organisations. We need to work more closely with people like Melbourne City Mission who work closely with young people who are at risk of homelessness. We need to work with people in the regions. We need to tackle the invidious and insidious fact that women aged over 55 are one of the fastest growing cohorts of homelessness. Right? We have to work together constructively and collaboratively. One of the proudest things I think that Richard Wynne, my predecessor, achieved, from my perspective, he might have a different view, but his decision to transfer 400 Homes Victoria homes to Aboriginal controlled community organisations. 400 homes. You think about that for a moment. That is the single biggest transfer of wealth from non-Indigenous Victorians to Indigenous Victorians since 1835. Like, it's profound. I think for me, I'm really pleased that as a member for Essendon, I deal with a lot of housing issues. I've got two very large public housing communities in Flemington and Ascot Vale. And that, as a consequence of some of this work, we've got the fast start where we're delivering 714 dwellings in places like Dunlop Avenue in Ascot Vale, as well as over at Ashburton, Heidelberg West and Hawthorn. And I had the great privilege of inspecting one of these new properties at Ascot Vale. And it's a knockout. Like, it's beautiful, right? It's accessible, it's energy efficient, it's decent, it's dignified, and it's in a cracking location. And it really sends an important message, I think, to people on the estate more broadly that, look, this is what we can do, and this is what we're aspiring for. The old estate was built in the 1940s by the first Cane government, right? Like the late 1940s. It was set up, built over 18 months, and we're delivering it now. And it's a really exciting time to think about what lay before us. and to see what we can achieve. It's also about recognising that these investments have that broader network benefit. Now, the big housing build is generating 10,000 jobs per annum. It's also ensuring that we've got the capacity to make sure that apprentices and cadets and trainees have an opportunity, and particularly with a focus in making sure that women can have careers in construction. These things are really important because you're providing an opportunity for members of the community to get an experience that lasts them a lifetime. They develop skills that will last them a lifetime. I remember in my first term of office, I met a young Somali Australian. He graduated from civil engineering at Melbourne University, and he couldn't get a job. And he said, you know, I'm black, I'm Muslim, my name is Mohammed, and I cannot get a job. And through some of the rail infrastructure projects that the government was doing at that time, there was an opportunity for people like Mohammed, and he got a job. And it wasn't the best job, wasn't the biggest job. He got a traineeship, and it started with 12 weeks. And I knew this guy. I thought, look, if he's given a chance, he will run at this hard, and he did. And the 12-week position became a 6-month position, which became a 2-year position, which became a permanent position. Right, so we've got the opportunity of using this investment, leveraging off this investment to deliver housing outcomes, because we need to get more housing on the ground to deal with these challenges. Now, there are these broader network benefits as well. Now, I'm really pleased that despite the fact that there wasn't a housing and homelessness ministers meeting for 5 years, the election of the Albanese Labor government has seen us meet twice. And what I really loved about those meetings I've had with my colleagues, we're all on the same page. No one's playing politics, no one's playing games. It's not a case of pointing fingers, it's not a case of one-upmanship. It's about basically saying, look, there is a problem, and we all recognise there's a problem, and now is the time to work together. And the wonderful thing with Julie Collins, the Federal Minister, she grew up in social housing. I think she's one of only 4 members of the House of Representatives who didn't finish high school. She's got an abiding passion for this. She's got a deep desire to work. And the great thing about us is that we're match fit. We're out there, we're working hard, you know, we're delivering the big housing build. We've got boots on the ground and we're delivering these projects, and there's an opportunity to strike now and work together now. It's a really exciting time. Now, I'm not being glib or trying to be dismissive of the challenges. I know the challenges. I've seen it. I've been out there and I've talked to people, and I've talked to service providers, and these are incredible challenges that confront us. But we're not coming at this from a standing start. We've got the investment, we've made the investment, we've got really strong partnerships, and there's an opportunity for us to strike and move forward, and to be bold and be brave. And you know, what does bold and brave mean? It means taking a risk. It means sometimes, you know what, it won't always work right. It won't be always perfect. But what's the alternative? We just go back to doing the way things were. We just take a risk-free approach. We don't take a risk, we don't have a chance, we don't have an original idea. I'm the minister, I know what's best, and I'll just do my thing. Like, that's not going to work. It's not going to cut it. People deserve better. Our clients at home in Victoria, your clients in the community housing sector deserve better. So now's the time. We've got the money. We've got the drive, we've got the energy, we've got the passion. You've got the knowledge. And we can't do this by ourselves. This is a partnership, and this is about working together. And finally now, with the Housing Accord with the Commonwealth, we have that opportunity. So, tough times lay in front of us. It's not going to be easy. And the challenges are very real. But now's the time to move forward, and we can do this together. And working together constructively and collaboratively, it's going to be amazing. We've got the chance to shift the dial. Because I'm telling you, like the other jurisdictions, they're not doing what we're doing. They're not as far advanced down the line as what we are. Right? Now's the time to seize the initiative. Go forward, be brave, take a risk, take a chance. Let's do this together. And while we're doing it together, let's try and have some fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Lots to do in that federal-state partnership. We'll now hear from Shadow Minister Reardon, who is the member for Polwarth, which is Colac to the Great Ocean Road, and he's lived there his entire life. Richard was in retail and supply prior to coming to Parliament, and he's brought to Parliament his passion for health education and infrastructure. In September 2021, Richard became Shadow Minister for Local Government and Shadow Minister for Resources, and he's been our Shadow Minister for Housing from February this year. So please join me in welcoming Shadow Minister Reardon to tell us what he would plan to do to create a clear and reliable pipeline for the growth of social housing beyond the big housing boom.
Thank you, Jenny, for the invitation to speak today, and thank you all to the members of the various agencies and organisations gathered here today who have worked hard for a long time in the face of what can only be described as a housing accessibility, affordability crisis across Victoria. As someone born and bred in the one community my entire life in Tolac, I've never known it to be so bad and so difficult for people to find a home. It was always something we heard about that happened in the big smoke away from our country communities. But there is not a community in Victoria today that is not touched by homelessness, a lack of affordability and availability of homes. I'm someone who's always been lucky. I've always lived in a home. I don't have a hard luck story to share with people about my experience of a home. But I do understand the value of a home. I bought the home off my family. I've lived in the one spot in my entire life. I understand how important it is that someone can put their roots down, call a place home and stay there and not be subject to the whims of government, to the whims of other agencies and landlords. It's an important part of creating and supporting a stable, functional and healthy environment and community that we all want to live in. So what are the challenges we have today? Well, we've seen the current government's approach. 8 years they've been at the helm. More than 300% increase in homelessness. The priority waiting lists have gone from 9,990 at the last record back in September 2014. We don't have the most recent reports because the government's, for some reason, taking a very long time to produce those. But as of June, it's in excess of 36,000. We've spent $5.5 billion, or spending $5.5 billion. It hasn't touched the sides. We heard from the Minister today about what the government's doing, how the government's doing this, the government's belief in providing more homes. What about the private sector? What about the philanthropic sector? What about the charitable sector? What about the community housing agencies that tell me, meeting after meeting, we have a property, we can do more, but we're held, we're handcuffed by government regulation, government grants are not flexible enough, they're not dynamic enough, they're not vibrant enough. I met with probably one of the largest philanthropic groups yesterday who own 6 acres of land within Cooee of the CBD. They have been knocking on the door of government for years to unleash the potential of the land that they have to create affordable housing, social housing, homeless housing. They want to do more but can't. The opportunity here in Victoria to tackle the 36,000 people, not people, but families, the 36,000 families that are on our priority list. These are people that I'm now seeing in my own country community. Older women sleeping in their cars out the front of the police station. I'm embarrassed. I am embarrassed that in a country town with lots of land and availability, it doesn't matter where you stand, you can see vacant land available in any regional town. And yet we have people forced to sleep in their car in front of the police station, walk around the corner of the hospital and use the public facilities there for showering. We have a network of support for these groups and people and individuals that find themselves that just doesn't have the support it needs. If you're a single mum in crisis, domestic violence, thrown from your home on a Thursday in a country town, guess what? There's no one available to take your call or find a place until next Monday. There's nowhere that you can go and get food relief because we only issue food relief in country Victoria on Mondays and Tuesdays. We don't have it available on other days of the week. It's a huge problem and it's gone nowhere. We've spent $5.5 billion and all we can see is the problem increasing. This is a whole of community problem. So how would I do it differently? Very differently. First of all, we all know, and your sector knows more than anyone, one of the big barriers is community acceptance to getting more social and affordable housing into our neighbourhoods. This government has decided to just sort of override the planning laws, which from my experience has often and at times made the problem worse because it's not worked with communities. So one example I've seen, the Surf Coast Shire is actually sitting down and being as proactive as they can with their local community to discuss the housing shortage, work with the community where the best locations are and what the community is prepared to accept. And that's where we have to go. This is an everybody problem. It's not just something that the state government can solve by itself. So the first thing we want to do is work, and I wear the other hat of shadow local government. We're going to work with local governments, get them to do proper, active, rational, sensible population plans. There's no point communities on the Mornington Peninsula or along the Great Ocean Road saying we don't have any houses available, but then no one lets you build one. So we have to work with the communities and say what's the appropriate housing, where can we put it, how will it look, and we need your support. So we have to work with communities. We can then go to other agencies. We've got superannuation companies falling over themselves to build properties for build to rent. Now, why haven't we been able to harness the build to rent for low cost, affordable and social housing? Because we just haven't put the effort into it. We currently have that model for the richest people in the state, but not the poorest. The state government has a vital role to play in unlocking the potential for that opportunity. And I think when we see $5.5 billion from government not even touching the sides of the homeless and housing crisis, then we know that government cannot do it by itself. So going forward, we've got to have government putting its resources where it needs it. I also know that you in this room will be well aware that there are certain people that find themselves in this position that really need the strongest wraparound support possible. That's where government's focus needs to be. It needs to be on those that really need that extra support. That individual that needs 2 or 3 permanent carers, who needs extra space around them. We need the resources of government going to those that need help that really can't be done in other ways. And the low-hanging fruit, if you like, the people that just need a home. The older single women, for example, as Minister Pearson pointed out, are the fastest and most rapidly growing cohort, which is a shame for all of us if that's the state. Those people can be found homes. They just need ones. So what are some of the other barriers? Well, we know, for example, the turnaround and maintenance on Homes Victoria is appallingly slow. I had a lady from, I think it was almost the Minister's electorate, was in the western suburbs, contact me just in the last week. She was allocated a single person's disability-friendly apartment 2 years ago. She's in the same block, she's currently on the 2nd floor. She goes past the apartment she's been allocated now for 2 years. All it requires is some door handle changes and a ramp addition on the bottom floor for her to go to. And still after 2 years, that simple renovation has not been done and that apartment's sitting empty. There's another whole apartment available. And I certainly know around my own communities in my own electorate, that the turnaround time on one of the state's greatest assets, which is its homes that it owns, is just not good enough. We need Homes Victoria to be the best landlord in the state, not one of the worst. And being one of the best landlords means prompt maintenance and turnaround. It's all very well to talk about building 12,000 new homes if you've got 6,000, 7,000 of them sitting empty and idle because we can't fix the taps, make the hot waters work properly. There's basics that we've got to get right from government. That's our responsibility. And we need to support your sector, the community housing and social housing sector, to do your job better and with more support from government so that you can help us build the homes that we need. And combined with other policies about fast-tracking land release around Victoria, another 50,000 in country Victoria, will put downward pressure on housing prices and put upward pressure on the availability for everybody to get a home. Because every person who's renting that wants a home can get out of the renting home and into their own home, that frees up another rental. So we've got to be more creative, more positive, and work with everybody that wants to help solve this terrible, terrible crisis that we have here in Victoria. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. I think I got your surname right with my second iteration. I apologise for the first one. And for outlining that emphasis on, I think, planning and institutional investment in social housing. We now have with us Samantha Ratnam, who's the MLC for Northern Metro and leader of the Victorian Greens. Sam began her professional life as a social worker and was the first Greens Lord Mayor of Moreland in 2015. Sam holds numerous portfolios for the Victorian Greens, including community services, consumer affairs, local government, and most importantly, from our perspective, housing and planning. So please join me in welcoming the leader of the Victorian Greens to let us know what she would do to create a clear and reliable pipeline for the growth of social housing beyond the big housing boom.
Well, good morning, nearly afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with you all here today. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on Wurundjeri land and pay my deep respects to elders past, present and emerging. Acknowledge that sovereignty over this land has never been ceded, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Firstly, I want to say to particularly all the housing providers in this room today, your work is some of the most important that our society does. And I know that from being inside and outside politics, and being outside politics in the community sector myself. Before moving into full-time politics 5 years ago, I worked in my professional life as a social worker, and in my last posting at the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, it was just a few weeks before I think I entered Parliament. And I'll never forget that call we made to housing providers in search of housing for our clients, and we know finding housing solutions for people seeking asylum and refuge is particularly challenging. But we hit a crisis point even 5 years ago when the responses we were getting from incredibly well-meaning but under-resourced housing services were, "We're so sorry, there's no emergency accommodation, all we have are sleeping bags. That is all we have to offer." And I've heard that things have got drastically worse since then. So I acknowledge just what a crisis you are all dealing with. The situation has indeed moved from crisis to catastrophe in Victoria. We know that our social housing stock has actually declined since 2014 levels, hovering at around 3% from 3.5%. We know that the number of people on the public housing waiting list has skyrocketed over the last 5 years, from around 80,000 when I first entered Parliament to over 120,000 people and counting now. We know that renters are doing it tough. Rents rising 3 to 4 times faster than wages, and at historic highs, low vacancy rates as well. And our homelessness services are underfunded and struggling with increased demand. Like all of you, I am beyond frustrated that we're still talking about housing in terms of incremental reform. And while I acknowledge and indeed we welcome the investment in the big build from this previous government, it is not enough. We need major, bold transformation in housing now. The last government was able to find $20 billion for 2 toll roads, but just a quarter of that for housing. Budgets are about priorities, and if anything reveals the heart of a government, it's what they prioritise and value in our budgets. That's why the Greens have prioritised housing in this last term of Parliament and indeed in this election campaign before us right now. We need to see a major commitment to the ongoing provision of housing, and we need to start that commitment now, not after the big housing build. The Greens are committed to a big build of 200,000 public and affordable homes over the next 20 years, including a big build of 100,000 public homes in the next 10 years, starting right now. We have a plan to end homelessness, and indeed I was so proud of the work we did to introduce the first bill of its kind in the last Victorian Parliament to end homelessness in Victoria by 2030. It is possible. Our bill would have ensured that housing was considered a human right in Victoria's Human Rights Charter, ensured a housing first approach, ensured that governments were committed to building this type of quantum of public housing, and would have required governments to be accountable for those plans, having to report annually and publicly against the plan to end homelessness by 2030. We also want much stronger measures to keep rents affordable and strengthen renters' rights. We also recognise the really important role played by the community housing sector. I want to thank the community housing sector for all the work that you do and acknowledge the role you play in the provision of more affordable housing, particularly in the provision of specialist housing and tailored models for specialised cohorts. I want to talk briefly about the politics of housing in this state. One thing that we have seen accelerate at a rate of knots is the pitting of public housing against community housing. This is what neoliberal governments do, and they're doing this right across the world. We've had successive governments withdrawing from their role and responsibility in providing affordable housing, and it is leading to dire consequences. The Greens believe that it is an essential and fundamental role of governments everywhere to provide affordable housing and support their communities. Housing policy has been put in the too hard basket for too long, and we're made to think that only small change around the edges are possible, but that is a con. We can end homelessness and make housing affordable, and public and community housing should be able to coexist in the housing continuum to be able to provide safe and secure homes for all. My appeal in conclusion to all of you and to all of us is to work together in collaboration to fight for more housing stock and more funding. We must demand more from government, and we must hold them accountable. We must push them to go further and faster on the things that Victorians need. And everywhere I'm going in this election campaign, whether it's in drug and alcohol services, mental health services, in the justice system, everyone is talking about housing, because all roads lead to housing. If we don't get housing right, everything in our community sector and our broader society starts to fall apart, and we are seeing the dire consequences of that in Victoria right now. We need that 10-year strategy for housing affordability to be developed and implemented now. We need that big build, the big increase in our housing stock to be committed to by all parties contesting in this election. We need thousands more affordable and public homes beginning to be built right now. That is the only way we're going to solve housing affordability in Victoria, and the Greens are absolutely committed to doing so. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and for outlining the importance of having a plan with big targets for our state. Now, I'm just going to check how we turn these microphones on. Might need a bit of, is it the button on the top? Need a bit of technical expertise here. Thank you.
Yes, it's the new projector. I think that's right. It's not the projector. This is on. This is on. I'm muted.
Yes, okay. So I've got two mics, so if you don't mind sharing
Yeah, absolutely.
and caring, that would be
Very happy.
fantastic. So now to the questions. Thank you very much, all of you, for those introductory remarks. So the first question is about one of the silver linings of COVID, which was the Victorian Government's investment in From Homeless to a Home, to provide housing and support needed by people with complexity in their lives coming out of the hotels. I mean, the program has unarguably been a great success in keeping people securely housed and enabling improvements in their health, employment and general well-being. But the problem is that the funding for that program is limited only to people who are in the hotels at a certain point in time during COVID, and even for that group, the funding at present is time limited. So can you each in turn tell us if you will extend this successful program, and what else you might do to provide the housing and support needed by people with more complex needs in our community who are without a home?
Yeah, okay. All right, well, look, I mean, I think this program was really designed at a moment in time as a health response. It was about making sure that people who were sleeping rough didn't contract coronavirus, nor did they, as a result of that, pass that on to others. And so this was a very targeted response to what was a deep crisis at that time. And as a consequence of that work, there's around about 1,700 people who have now... Is that me? No. There's now about 1,700 people who have been securely housed, which is terrific. In terms of the recent state budget, we've provided $75 million in additional funding for housing and homelessness services. So I think going forward, I mean, I think that, look, words are fine. It's fine to come here and, promise all sorts of things. Judge us from our deeds, right? And I think that the sector expects a government to deliver and it's deeds, not words. And I think that we've got a track record of delivery. Again, as I said earlier, I don't underestimate the challenges, but you've got to be out there and you've got to be working hard. We've housed 1,700 people, and we'll continue to work with the sector to come up with innovative solutions to deal with this going forward.
We're absolutely committed to extending the homelessness program beyond the initial commitment. And I think a really important observation, and all of you have experienced this working at the forefront of those services, that we saw through that program, and while it might have been conceived of initially as a health response, what we saw deliver was the possibility of starting to resolve homelessness unlike we had been able to do before. And it was about the investment, it was about the prioritisation of ensuring that everyone, particularly people experiencing street homelessness, were able to access housing as a matter of urgent priority. Let's not let that possibility go. The Greens are committed to $100 million extra for homelessness services over the next 4 years that goes beyond what governments have committed previously, and it's the type of quantum that we need, and we're hearing from homelessness services is needed to ensure that program can continue and ensure that we have the support services available for clients as well. What we're hearing very concerningly is when you don't have the funding for the support services as well, and this goes to the housing first approach, we must start moving to that approach to ensure those services are there once we're able to find the adequate housing as well, because then otherwise the housing solutions start to break down when you don't have those support services. So we need this type of quantum. That's why we're committed to $100 million to be able to support programs like these. In the context of a big transformation about how we see ending homelessness in Victoria. We want that ambition on the table. We want governments to commit to ending homelessness by 2030. When you have that type of commitment, you then have the type of investment starting right now to be able to get to that target. Without that commitment, you get this kind of tinkering around the edges and incremental reform, push and pull that we have been seeing for many years now. Thanks.
Thank you. As I outlined in my talk earlier, increasing supply is the only way we can solve the homeless problem, the homeless housing crisis that we saw during the COVID breakdown. We've had empty hotels and apartments. We put people in them. We couldn't keep doing that because those accommodations went back to their own use. But we do currently have, and there'll be people in this room who represent those agencies, old, well out-of-date boarding houses and other institutions in around in Collingwood, in Hawthorn, and down at St Kilda and other places, where the need is chronic. Now, those agencies tell me all they need is the support from government to allow them to keep title of their property so that they've got the financial backing to do the developments, redevelop their services, and create fit-for-purpose modern facilities. We know how many people we've currently got sleeping rough at any one, or approximately at any one time. We know the measure of it. Our social welfare agencies and community groups and philanthropic groups and others are dealing with these people on a daily basis. It's not rocket science, it's not hidden from us, it's in everybody's view. And yet the financial mechanisms, the planning mechanisms, the coordination mechanisms that government can control are just not being used. The levers are not being pulled in the right direction. The industry, the people trying to do more in this space tell me it's because the government wants to keep control of the solutions. And I'm very clearly saying to the sector and to the industry and to those trying to deal with this most chronic of problems, that we will work with you with your solutions. If you've got an idea, you've got a mechanism, you've got the land, you've got the opportunity, come and talk to us, because we will let you go ahead with what works for your agency, in your community, and that will deliver the results that you need to get up and running. We do have to stop talking about it. We do have to stop throwing just money at it. It's more than money that's required. It's initiative, it's opportunity, and it's the drive to actually measure the success of the program by the amount of people we no longer have waiting for a home.
Many thanks, and if I can just stress that really continuing to fund the Homeless to a Home program should be a no-brainer. To the next question, the community sector has, the community housing sector has a history of delivering housing to groups that are often marginalised in our community and by the private market. So, for example, Darren's here from Aboriginal Housing Victoria, which provides Aboriginal control over ownership and management of social housing for First Nations people. We have women's property initiatives catering specifically for women, and Winteringham delivers for older tenants. So can you tell us how you see the role of community housing in delivering in Aboriginal community controlled housing, as it has been doing, and housing for other marginalised groups?
Yeah, so I think, look, this is for us, my perspective, there's an opportunity to work together constructively and collaboratively. Look, this is, as I said earlier, this is the single biggest investment in social and affordable housing in the nation's history. So I don't accept the notion that we are tinkering around the edges. This is a huge investment that we're making, and we are deliberately targeting a number of marginalised cohorts. And that's why we're making sure that we're allocating 1,000 homes for victims of family violence, which builds on the landmark work that we did in relation to the Royal Commission into Family Violence. It's why we're making sure that 10% of the net growth in social housing goes to Aboriginal Victorians managed through self-determination principles. Right? I'm not having this sort of paternalistic, colonialist approach where the state deems what's best for Indigenous Victorians. We want to empower Indigenous Victorians, because I bet an Indigenous Victorian community controlled organisation has got a better insight and knowledge about what their people need than what a faceless bureaucrat sitting in Lonsdale Street thinks. Right? This is about empowering, and it's about making sure that members of the community have got the opportunity to be in charge of their own destiny. It's about making sure that we're providing 2,000 dwellings for people living with a mental illness. It's about working with veterans housing. It's about working with Melbourne City Mission in relation to its work with young people experiencing homelessness. Like, these are really important initiatives, and it's about working together. And again, it's not just about words; it's about deeds. It's what we have done as a government, what we'll continue to do. I note that some would say that only social housing can go on public land. I do not believe that. I think that if there is public land that is owned by either a local government like Yarra or by the state government, if there's an opportunity to partner with the community housing sector to develop that land for social and affordable housing, then we should do that. We should not let ideology blind us to delivering an outcome for the people who need it most. This is a case of a partnership. It's about working together. It's about trying to tackle this problem, because as I said earlier, there are many different faces to homelessness, to housing poverty. The state does not have all the answers. And I want to work constructively with the sector, with all of you, to try and find ways in which we can deal with these matters in a really constructive and thoughtful and considered manner.
We absolutely recognise the need to urgently invest more in Aboriginal community-controlled housing. Using the community housing model has proved to be very effective, and there needs to be much further investment in it. And to acknowledge the nature of the problem that we are facing. 1 in 6 First Nations people in Victoria have access to a homelessness service, more than 10 times the rate of other Victorians. First Nations people are also overrepresented in our housing waiting list, making up about 7% of the housing register, compared to making up approximately 1% of the population. We know First Nations people have lower rates of home ownership than other Victorians, and more likely to experience barriers to private rentals, such as racism. So we acknowledge the nature of the problem. That's why we need more investment in these types of models of providing housing. But to ensure these models succeed, we must have more stock. The stock that we are talking about building currently under the plan is just not enough. When you look at that waiting list of over 120,000 people, 25,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night, we know the problem is only going to get worse, and you just have to look at what's happening with cost of living pressures bearing down on people. Housing is the biggest contributor to the cost of living pressure that people are experiencing. We must raise our ambition in providing more stock, because if we don't have the stock, we can't provide the specialist solutions. That is why we have been so focused on pushing governments to expand their vision and ambition for building more stock.
I fully support the concept of community housing agencies that have specialists and expertise with certain cohorts that need housing. But as a minister, I would be blind to the need of who, or what, or I wouldn't be picking winners on different groups and cohorts. If you're homeless, you're homeless. And I think we have to get to a point in Victoria where we stop having to tick boxes as to whether you get help or support. The challenge for all of us is everybody who's homeless. Anyone that doesn't have a safe, affordable, accessible home to go to at night has a problem, and the role of the government is to facilitate the solving of that problem. I watched Miriam Margolyes on her treks around Victoria the other night on TV, and she interviewed some of Melbourne's homeless, and I thought, you know, this is an interesting image to be put into the rest of the world. It doesn't matter whether you're Indigenous, First Nations, it doesn't matter whether you're a migrant, it doesn't matter what your background is. In the case of the person Miriam interviewed in front of Parliament House, what's more, was a man from a private school education who things hadn't gone right in his life, and he finds himself, and many of us here in this room would have probably walked past him, as I'm sure I have, near Elphiston House. And I thought, you know, it doesn't matter what your background. If there's an agency out picking and has an expertise with certain cohorts, that's great. We will support you. But we need to support everybody, because everybody deserves that home, that space and that wraparound support. It doesn't matter where you come from. So from my perspective, I'm agnostic as to who it. We have such a task in front of us. Samantha talks about the 120,000. It's an enormous figure. It's an enormous figure that has grown enormously over the last 8 years. We have to stop talking about it. We have to stop saying that only government can solve it. We have to unleash every weapon that we have in our arsenal of finance, of support, of land, of agencies, and most importantly, the people in the industry, the people in the sector that really understand the problem, and listen to them and take their advice and leadership on how we go about solving it.
I'll now, despite what you just said, Richard, I'll just turn our mind to young people who are...
I care about them too.
Yes, who are fleeing unsafe homes and can't return home. And they need, you know, special services, specialist interventions that take into account their young age. They can be at risk of exploitation, and adult homelessness options like motels are not the place for them. And they also need support to thrive if they can't return home. So right now we haven't had a youth homelessness strategy in living memory, and we need one to provide a system architecture for specialist youth homelessness services. Will you create a youth homelessness strategy if you're elected, and better resource programs to reduce youth homelessness?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So I think we can do better, and I think we have to do better. The big housing bill allocated $50 million to youth homelessness, and I think that if I'm fortunate enough to be the Minister for Housing after the election, and that's something I do want to look at quite carefully and thoughtfully. We have established the Home Stretch program, which is about sort of extending that residential care for kids between 18 and 21. So that's something I think I really want to look at doing, and really trying to pursue that further. And I agree with what Sam said. If we don't have the stock, we can't provide the special solution. She's absolutely right. But again, I come back to judge us on our deeds. You know, Yarra City Council had an opportunity to develop some land in April last year, 100 social and affordable housing dwellings and 100 private dwellings. And the council voted that down because they didn't want the land being sold off to the private sector, making money for developers. Now, you know, I think that's flawed. I honestly think that's flawed. Now, I know I'm not expecting Samantha to be an apologist for the Yarra City Council, but I think it's a really flawed approach. You know, judge us by our deeds. We've put $50 million into youth housing. You know, I'm committed to doing more in this space. And, you know, I think that we've got we've got that sort of the runway to get this done. You know, we've got the funding that we've done today. We've got a partner in Canberra who's genuinely interested in working constructively and collaboratively. And again, I think there's an opportunity to continue a discussion in this forum with you about how we can try and tackle this issue in a more considered and thoughtful way, and in a bigger way, in the event that we're lucky enough to be returned.
Thanks, Judy, for the question. And in response to it, yes, to a youth homelessness strategy. And within that, what we want to see, what the Greens want to see, is a youth housing guarantee. That's what the Greens are committed to pursuing. where any young person under the age of 25 who presents to a homelessness service is guaranteed appropriate housing, like youth specialist housing. We know that young people are experiencing increasingly higher rates of youth homelessness, often due to family breakdown or family violence. At the moment, 26% of people experiencing homelessness in Victoria are aged between 12 and 24. And due to the severe shortage of affordable and appropriate housing options for young people experiencing homelessness are often ending up in very unsuitable housing, such as rooming houses, overcrowded short-term accommodation, where they're particularly vulnerable. So we want to see this prioritised, and you can do that when you have more housing stock. And if I can take up some of the assertions of the Minister and some of the commentary that's occurred on this panel previously, talking about the role of government, we cannot solve housing affordability without government. We cannot solve it without governments taking up their responsibility to provide affordable housing. And what we have seen is absolutely the contrary over the last decade or so. Governments increasingly withdrawing from their responsibility and role in providing affordable housing. It's the reason we've got the situation before us. It's the reason we often have very overcomplicated models, therefore forcing people to have to deliberate in these very complex systems. And I know many of you having to compete for tenders, all the work that goes into the administration of a service system that should be much simpler to be much more effective in providing that housing stock. And one thing the Greens have vociferously fought against is the privatisation of public housing land. If we're going to build 100,000 public homes, which we have to do in the next decade to solve homelessness and increase housing affordability, we are going to have to keep the existing stock of public housing land to build more public housing. Once you sell that off to private developers, you never get that back. I was on Marybeck Council when one of these programs was foisted upon our community, telling us that our public housing estate was going to be sold off, the majority of it sold to private developers for private housing. In the midst of a housing crisis, we fought so hard against it, and while we weren't able to convince the government to save it all, because of that community campaign against the privatisation of public housing land, we got more social housing onto all those estates. That's what community campaigning can do. That's what the Greens will do in Parliament every time we come up against this challenge of privatisation of our public assets.
While Samantha's out campaigning to stop houses being built, I'll be working actively with people that can build houses and homes and places for people to live. But more importantly to our young people, it is a crisis. And I know in my own electorate, again, of a population of around 1,500 secondary school students, 300 do not attend school regularly in a country town. And as I indicated earlier, those 300 kids that are on couches, sleeping in mates' places, in the backs of cars, they don't even have access to food. At least in larger metropolitan areas, there are food shelters and food support. It's a chronic problem across the state. We absolutely need a youth homelessness support and a support policy, but it's got to be in conjunction with the education department, and we have to offer more opportunities. Most people forget, if you live outside of metropolitan Melbourne in one of our many, many regional towns, even the size of Colac, they only have one school. They only have one school. And we know what young people like today. It's as complex as ever. If you're in a town with one school and you don't fit in that school, whether you're LGBTQI, whether you're whatever complication you have as a young person, you are left stranded. There are no policies, no supports. There are no incentives or support to help you go to the next town to another school. You fall out of the system. Across regional and Western Victoria, for example, we're up to a couple of schools are 60% non-attendance, 40% is the average. It's a crisis out there for young people. There is not the support mechanisms there, and I absolutely support getting a system in place that really picks up kids at school who are most at risk and putting them in a situation where they can have the support that they need. Because we know a young person with somewhere safe to stay, not the dodgy, shady lady motel down the end of the street, but somewhere safe with support where they can continue their training, whether it's through an apprenticeship or other work-based support or back at school. These are the things that we must prioritise. And we know for many, many young people, give them that support early, wrap around some services and give them some work in life, you can get many of them back on track quite quickly. But what we're doing at the moment is letting far too many sit and linger in a system that just lacks support.
Well, I've got a long list of questions that we really wanted to ask you all, but this will have to be the last one because you've all been so generous in your responses. But as Victoria plans new and upgraded housing and infrastructure for the 2026 Commonwealth Games, how should government best ensure that these games leave a lasting legacy to help solve our housing affordability crisis here in Victoria?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. And look, I think this opportunity is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for making a significant investment in regional Victoria. And I think, look, Richard, could point to this in terms of the changes he's seen in Surf Coast Shire over his lifetime, but even over the last, probably 2 or 3 years since COVID. People in Melbourne are starting to realise just what a beautiful place it is to live and raise a family in regional Victoria. And a lot of people are going into those communities. And that's a welcome thing at one level. I mean, the unemployment rate in regional Victoria now is got a 2 in front of it. I mean, it's probably, you have to go back to the gold rush to see an unemployment rate like that in regional Victoria. But with that brings challenges, and as I'm sure Richard could point to, where you've got people who may have long-standing connection to country or may have lived in that particular town for a long period of time and they're finding that they're being priced out of the market. So I think from the government's perspective, we want to work really closely with business leaders and communities in the 4 regional hubs to identify the sites for villages and to finalise the sports program. Obviously, we need to make sure that the housing is fit for purpose for the games itself. But then it's trying to think about how do we actually make sure these assets can be repurposed for those communities going forward. How do we make sure that this is the right fit for those communities? As part of that, we're looking at getting Engaged Victoria and Development Victoria to work with the public to share their aspirations for the Commonwealth village sites. Again, coming back to my earlier comments, I don't think it's a case of us imposing a solution on regional communities. I think it's a case of working with those 4 regional hubs to say, well, look, these are the sort of sports that will be played here. This is the sort of athletes we have to house. This is the sort of the number. And what do you think the needs should be going forward? And look, every region's going to have a different view. I've got no doubt that the views and aspirations of Geelong will be different to Ballarat or Bendigo or the Valley. And it's about working together and leaving that lasting legacy behind for regional Victoria, because I think regional Victoria really needs it. And I think that what we've seen in recent times, what we're going to see going forward, we really need to make sure those investments occur. But it's an exciting opportunity for regional Victoria, and it's something I really want to work very closely, if I'm fortunate enough to be here in a few weeks' time, with my colleagues, including the Deputy Premier, to make sure we get this right for the communities.
There is a huge missed opportunity, I think, for the Commonwealth Games. For example, in Geelong, there's 1,900 people live in the Geelong CBD. It's our second largest city and it's a smaller population than most of the towns in my small Western District communities. We're going to put 2,500 village spots on the edge of Geelong at Warren Ponds next to a train line between another busy road. Geelong does not, even a city the size of Geelong, does not have the capacity to support that level of accommodation crammed in one spot. And I probably don't need to highlight to any of you here the lack of logic that provides. There have been no clear messages given to anyone in regional Victoria. Mind you, there's a similar example in the Latrobe Valley. I've met with the City Council over there for the same problem. There's an enormous opportunity to make a clear message to regional Victoria that we could have good quality portable accommodation that could be very quickly transported out and moved throughout our regions. FYI, the big bill has not put one home in Kalakotway Shire, for example. There's still an enormous amount of demand for accommodation. But more importantly, in a place like Geelong with such potential as a major regional centre, why aren't we having the conversation about building good quality, long-term accommodation in pods around the city or within a certain distance, so that at the end of the games this can be a mix of affordable social and community housing within the one precinct? But we're not having those conversations. Again, as I highlighted, the importance of dealing directly with local council, the Geelong City, the Latrobe City, none of these places have been engaged with and worked with about where they need the accommodation and where the potential lays. So there is a huge opportunity. We've got a lot of people to house, but after the games we definitely need a legacy that is going to house our people, our communities, and look after them into the future. And it will be a shame if we don't use this opportunity to maximise the benefit for all regional Victorians.
So with the games coming before us, I understand that we're probably anticipating, approximately, based on 2018 Brisbane Games, around 1,200, if not more, homes that will be built to accommodate the athletes, which we're hopeful can contribute to the social housing stock, and I know there have been asks made of that. We'd like to see all that housing stock be made social housing post the Games, given the levels of homelessness and the rise of the public housing waiting list. We need to look for every opportunity to increase our social housing stock. Here is the perfect opportunity. I wish we didn't have to wait for international sporting events to descend upon Victoria, where we can start thinking about how we boost numbers by 1,200. But that's a type of the shape that Victoria is in, where we have to hope that we'll have an extra 1,500 houses be available for social housing because of these one-off events. But it's an opportunity. Let's make sure they're well designed. Let's make sure they cater to the range of housing needs of people on that social housing waiting list and turn it all into social housing. Just speaking briefly, though, to the particular housing needs in rural and regional communities, and this opens up the conversation about what's happening there. And travelling there, especially over the last few months, hearing so much from communities about the housing crisis that's facing our rural and regional communities. Some people approximating that up to 50% of their housing stock is being locked up, particularly in short stays, so much so that workers who want to come and work in rural economies and regional economies, because there's a shortage of workers, can't find housing stock, therefore businesses can't find workers, and you have this domino effect in terms of economic decline because there's not enough housing for people. Families are not able to find affordable rentals. So we've outlined short stay regulation policy that would free up a lot of those homes to go into the private rental market. New South Wales is already doing it. Victoria should follow suit as a matter of urgency to free up that stock for more rental housing. We also want to see, as part of our 200,000 build, proper inclusionary zoning, so these big property developments, 30% are set aside for first homeowners, not investors, so that we get the stock in affordable housing and public housing. And contrary to what might have been asserted on this panel this morning, only the Greens are talking about a build of affordable housing at the quantum of 200,000. No one else is talking about that quantum. We want everyone to commit to that type of stock of building. That is about building more affordable homes. Only the Greens are talking about the quantum that we need to end homelessness and solve housing affordability in Victoria once and for all.
Well, I personally am very sorry that we have run out of time, because I think what we have seen is three leaders who are passionate and engaged and ambitious in this area. And I think we thank you for being here at this stage of the campaign, but also for your forthrightness and generosity in your responses. Can I thank CHIA again for the partnership in bringing today's event to bear, and to all of you who have attended. And I believe there's probably still some refreshments to go. So thanks heaps.
Thank you.